The year was 2287, and humanity had been part of the Galactic Accord for 31 years. 31 years of following rules. 31 years of asking for respect. 31 years of being told to wait, to be patient, to prove themselves worthy. And for 31 years, the other species in the Accord had smiled at humans the way adults smile at small children who do not yet understand the world. The Galactic Accord was old, far older than anyone on Earth could truly imagine. It had been built 800 years ago by species who had been sailing the stars while humans were still learning to write. It had 47 member civilizations, each with its own fleet, its own history, and its own idea of how the galaxy should be run. At the top of it all sat the Grand Council, a body of elected representatives from each species, meeting every few years on a station so large it could hold a small city inside its walls. Humanity had joined the Accord in 2256, after first contact was made with the Velhari, a tall, blue-skinned people who communicated in layered tones and viewed time as a circle rather than a line. The Velhari had been kind, in their own distant way. They had guided humans through the entry process, helped them translate the Accord's thousands of pages of laws and treaties, and explained, gently, what it meant to be a Tier 3 species. Tier 3 meant new, it meant young, it meant allowed to trade, allowed to settle new colony worlds, allowed to send representatives to the Grand Council, to speak, but rarely to vote. And it meant something else, something written in thick legal language, buried deep in the Accord's founding charter. Tier 3 species were not permitted to construct, maintain, or operate warships. No fleet weapons, no military-grade hull plating, no mass destruction armaments of any kind. The official reason was always the same. Young species were unpredictable. Their histories were violent. They needed time to mature before they could be trusted with weapons that could burn moons. Ambassador Yara Osei had heard that reason so many times she could recite it in her sleep. She was a tall woman with close-cropped gray hair and eyes that had seen enough to make most people look away. She had spent 15 years representing Earth at the Grand Council, and she had learned very quickly that respect there was not something that was given. It was something that the powerful allowed the weak to believe they had. On the 14th day of the Third Assembly of 2287, she stood at the center podium of the Grand Council chamber and made the case, again, for humanity's right to self-defense. The chamber was enormous, a great curved bowl of polished stone with hundreds of seats rising in tiers on all sides. Every seat was filled. Representatives from 46 species watched her as she spoke. She kept her voice level. She used the Accord's own language, her words translated in real time by the small device clipped to her collar. She spoke about the raids on the Vareth frontier. She spoke about the 3 human colonies that had been attacked in the past 18 months. She spoke about the people who had died. Human colonies on the Vareth frontier had been growing for a decade. Vareth was a cluster of systems on the outer edge of explored space, rich in minerals and with 2 planets well suited for farming. Humans had worked hard to build there. They had brought families, built schools, raised buildings from the red soil, and planted seeds in ground no human hand had ever touched before. Then the Kreth came. The Kreth Dominion was a powerful, aggressive civilization, and an Accord member in good standing. They had claimed for generations that the Vareth systems were part of their historical territory. The Grand Council had never formally agreed with that claim, but it had never formally disagreed either. It was the kind of legal gray area that powerful species created on purpose, because gray areas were useful things to have when you wanted room to act without consequences. The first raid came on a colony called New Harrow. It was a small settlement, maybe 3,000 people. The Kreth ships appeared out of FTL without warning, fired on the colony's infrastructure, destroyed 2 of the landing pads and the main water processing plant, and were gone before any kind of distress signal could reach a relay station. 41 people died. The Accord issued a statement expressing concern and calling for restraint. The second raid, 6 months later, hit the farming colony of Sellas Ridge. 212 people died. The Accord called for a committee to investigate. The third raid destroyed the colony of Brightwell entirely. No survivors. The Accord said it would schedule a hearing. Standing in the Grand Council chamber, Ambassador Osei laid all of this out in plain language. She did not shout. She did not beg. She simply described what had happened and asked the assembled representatives of 46 civilizations what they planned to do about it. The response from the Kreth delegate came first. He was a large creature, broad-shouldered with a layered exoskeleton the color of old rust. He stood at his own podium across the chamber and spoke in the Kreth language, which the translators rendered in cool, flat tones. He said that the incidents on the Varath frontier were an internal matter. He said that human settlers had established themselves in disputed territory without proper authorization. He said that the Kreth Dominion regretted any loss of life, but could not be held responsible for the consequences of human trespass. Then the representative from the Solhari Collective spoke. Then the delegate from the Muir Federation. One after another they offered the same careful, bloodless language. Regrettable, complex, under review, premature to assign blame. Not one of them suggested that the Kreth should stop. The vote on a formal censure failed 39-8. Ambassador Osei walked out of the Grand Council chamber into the long corridor beyond, and she stood there for a long time, alone, looking at the floor. On Earth, the footage of the council session ran on every news service for 3 days. The reactions were not calm. People filled streets in a dozen cities. Families of the dead from Brightwell and Sellas Ridge and New Harrow stood in front of cameras and said the same thing in 100 different ways. That the Accord did not protect them. That the prohibition on warships was not a rule designed for their safety. That it was a cage. In a secure conference room inside the UN Space Command headquarters in Geneva, 12 people sat around a long table and listened to a recording of the Grand Council session in silence. When it ended, the chair of the meeting, a retired admiral named Gus Tanaka, set his hands flat on the table and looked around the room. He did not make a speech. He did not talk about justice or revenge or history. He said 4 words. We start tonight. Quietly. That was how Project Unshackled began. No formal vote in the General Assembly. No press conference. No announcement to allies. Just 12 people in a room and a decision that would change everything about what it meant to be human in the galaxy. Nobody outside that room knew what was being set in motion. But the Accord had made a mistake. It had told humanity they were too dangerous to be trusted with weapons. And then by doing nothing while human children burned, it had made absolutely certain that humans would build them anyway. The facility had no name in any official database. On the Accord's shipping registry, the coordinates it occupied belonged to something called the Callisto Deep Extraction Station 7. A mineral processing operation licensed to a company called Bren-Holt Industrial Resources, which was itself owned by a holding company, which was owned by another holding company, which, if you traced it far enough, through 9 layers of corporate paperwork, eventually connected to a small investment firm in Reykjavik that had not filed a public report in 4 years. Nobody was expected to trace it that far. That was the point. The dark side of Callisto, Jupiter's largest moon, was cold and old and very, very quiet. The moon had no atmosphere worth mentioning, and its surface was a mess of ancient craters and frozen plains that had not changed in billions of years. It was, in almost every way, a deeply uninteresting place, which made it perfect. Chief Engineer Mara Voss had been there for 9 months when the steel skeleton of the first hull began to take real shape. She stood on a gantry inside the main construction bay, a vast underground chamber carved into the moon's rock, and looked down at what her team had built. The chamber was lit by rows of white industrial lights that made everything look sharp and clean. The air smelled of metal and welding compound, and the particular dry cold that came from the recycled atmosphere pushed through filters a dozen times a day. Mara was 38 years old, thin with dark circles under her eyes that had nothing to do with the long hours and everything to do with the fact that she had not slept properly since she got the news about her brother. His name had been Piotr. He had lived in Brightwell. He had been 34 years old, and he had been a teacher, and he was gone now in a way that had left something hollow in the center of her chest that no amount of work had yet managed to fill. She had read the assignment briefing 4 times on the transport out to Callisto. By the 3rd read, she had stopped seeing it as a mission and started seeing it as the only thing left that made sense to do. The legal framework they were working inside was tight, clever, and dangerous. It had been drafted by a team of international law specialists who had spent 3 months reading every line of the Accord's charter. What they found was a loophole that was either a genuine oversight or the most optimistic piece of legal writing in human history. The Accord defined a warship by what it carried at the time of official registration. A ship registered as a civilian freighter was a civilian freighter. It did not matter what its hull was made of. It did not matter how thick its armor plating was. It did not matter that its internal geometry, the exact spacing of its load-bearing frames, and the shape of its power conduit routing happened to be perfect for handling the recoil stress of a weapons array that had not yet been attached. None of that was in the definition. A ship was what it was registered as. The weapons themselves were being built in 5 separate facilities across the outer solar system. Each one was registered as part of a different kind of operation. The weapons bays, which would slot into purpose-built recesses in the hulls, were listed as modular cargo handling equipment. The ammunition handling systems were registered as bulk material processing units. Every single component had a civilian designation and a stack of paperwork to back it up. It was, Mara thought, the most elaborate lie she had ever been part of. It was also the most important. The engineering team numbered 260 people. They had been selected over 8 months through a process that looked, on paper, like a standard deep space industrial recruitment drive. In reality, every single person had been vetted 3 times over. They were the best ship engineers on Earth. They were machinists and materials scientists and reactor specialists and structural analysts. A third of them had lost someone in the Vareth raids. The AI design system they worked with had been built specifically for this project. Someone in the development team had named it Ares, and the name had stuck. Ares did not look impressive. It lived in a server cluster in a reinforced room 2 levels below the main construction bay, and its interface was a simple screen with a text input. What it did was run simulations, combat simulations, hull stress tests, weapons integration models, damage scenarios. By the time the first hull was 30% complete, Ares had run over 900 million simulations. It had modeled how the ships would perform against every known class of Accord warship, testing against their known weapon systems, their tactical patterns, their standard engagement protocols. It had found 62 structural weaknesses in the original hull design and suggested corrections for all of them. It had identified that the reactor housing in the first draft was 3% too far aft for optimal weapons power distribution, and recommended moving it forward by a specific amount. Mara had looked at that recommendation, run the numbers herself by hand, and found that Ares was right. She had moved the reactor housing forward, and not slept for 2 days thinking about all the things she might have missed without the system's help. The ships were not small. The lead vessel, which had already been given the name Prometheus by the people building her, was 410 meters long. Her hull plating was a new alloy developed by the materials team, a layered composite that was technically classified as heavy industrial shielding, used in asteroid mining operations to protect equipment from rock impacts. It was several times stronger than anything the Accord considered standard civilian grade. It was not technically military armor. It just happened to perform like it. In month 8, an Accord inspector arrived. His name was something that translated roughly to Examiner Vel, and he was a Moor, short and wide with 4 arms, and a habit of touching things with the tip of his lower left finger before looking at them, as if taste came before sight. He arrived with 2 staff members and a scanning unit, and a list of registered facility specifications. Mara met him at the surface airlock, and spent the next 11 hours showing him around. She showed him the surface processing equipment, real mineral extraction machinery that her team ran every day to maintain the cover. She showed him the certified dormitory levels, the cafeteria, the medical bay. She showed him the upper 2 levels of the underground construction chamber, which had been dressed, in the preceding 3 weeks, to look exactly like a heavy freight hauler assembly facility, which it technically was. The frames of 3 hulls were visible. She explained the production schedule. She showed him the cargo manifests. She did not show him the lower levels, where the specialized hull work happened. She did not mention Ares. When Examiner Vell's scanning unit produced a reading that showed an anomalous power signature 3 levels below the floor they were standing on, Mara explained, without missing a beat, that it was the secondary reactor for the deep ice boring equipment. She had a folder ready with the maintenance records. Vell looked at the folder, touched it with his lower left finger, and handed it back. He filed a clean report. Callisto Extraction Station 7 was in full compliance with Accord regulations. After he left, Mara went back to the construction bay and stood at the gantry railing for a long time. Her hands were shaking slightly, which she found irritating. She had not been afraid during the inspection, not exactly. What she had felt was something closer to fury, quiet and compressed. That a Moore inspector with a scanning unit could have ended everything. That they were doing something extraordinary in secret, because the people who ran the galaxy had decided that humans did not deserve to do it openly. The shaking stopped after a minute. She gripped the railing, looked down at the hull of Prometheus, and got back to work. 2 months after the inspection, the lead hull was complete. 13 other hulls were in various stages of construction across the 7 hidden facilities, at Callisto, at Titan, in the asteroid belt, and at the 2 deep space dry docks that did not appear in any navigation chart that was not classified at the highest human security level. Prometheus sat in the construction bay, fully framed, plated, and internally fitted. She looked, to anyone examining her registration documents, exactly like a heavy freight hauler designed for long-haul intersystem cargo transport. She looked that way because Mara's team had been very careful. She looked that way because the weapons had not been attached yet. The proposal had been submitted 6 weeks in advance, drafted by 3 different legal teams, reviewed by the UN Secretary General, approved by the Security Council, and translated into the 47 official languages of the Galactic Accord. It was a formal request, structured according to the Accord's own procedural code, asking the Grand Council to consider granting humanity Tier 2 status, which would include the right to military sovereignty and the removal of the warship prohibition. It was the 5th time humanity had submitted such a request. Each previous attempt had been rejected without a formal vote. This time, Ambassador Osei had insisted on a full-session debate. She had a right to it under Article 19 of the Accord Charter, which allowed any Tier 3 species to petition for status review every 5 years. It could not be dismissed without at least being heard. The Grand Council chamber was full. Observers from dozens of species crowded the upper galleries. Representatives sat in their appointed seats in the great curved bowl of the chamber, some of them already wearing expressions that made it clear they had made up their minds before a single word was spoken. The air had that particular quality of a room where powerful people have gathered to perform the act of listening while doing something else entirely. Ambassador Osei stood at the center podium and delivered the case with the quiet precision of someone who had stopped hoping and started recording. She spoke for 40 minutes. She described the Varath raids in detail. She named every colony. She named the dead. She placed before the chamber a formal record of every diplomatic communication humanity had sent to the Accord regarding the Kreth Dominion's actions over the past 2 years, along with a notation of the response each one had received, which was, in every case, a variation of the same message. The matter was under review. She asked the Grand Council, plainly and directly, what guarantee a Tier 3 species had under Accord law if that law could not protect them. She asked what the prohibition on warships was meant to achieve, if not to ensure that new species could not defend themselves when the Accord decided their lives were not worth the political cost of protecting. She did not raise her voice. She did not accuse. She simply described what had happened and asked the assembled council what they called it. Then she stepped back from the podium and waited. The Crest Dominion's delegate rose first. His name was Warlord-Designate Chirth, and he was younger than his predecessor, broader, and carried himself with the particular ease of someone who had never once worried about what happened to people who could not fight back. He walked to the opposing podium and looked across the chamber at Ambassador Osei for a moment before he spoke. What he said, in the flat tones of the translator feed, was this: that humanity had existed in space for barely 3 decades, that the Verath systems were a matter of ongoing territorial interpretation, that the Accord had mechanisms for resolving such interpretations, and that those mechanisms were functioning exactly as intended, that a species with humanity's history of internal warfare, a history that any Accord member could review at will in the freely available records of Earth's own civilization, should perhaps spend a little more time demonstrating that it could live peacefully among its own people before asking for the tools to project violence outward. Then he said that the idea of human warships was frankly a source of some amusement. He said the word amusement, and then he returned to his seat. There was a sound in the chamber after that, a low, layered sound from many different throats and resonators and breathing chambers. It took a moment for the human observers in the upper gallery to understand what they were hearing. The representatives of 46 civilizations were laughing. Not all of them, but enough. The sound spread through the curved chamber in waves, some of it polite, some of it less so. The delegate from the Sarathi Imperium leaned toward a neighbor and said something, the two of them exchanging the particular body language of shared mockery. The Moor representatives in the 3rd tier were making a clicking sound with their lower arms that the human linguists had long ago identified as a sign of derision. Even the Velhari, who had first guided humanity into the Accord, and who were generally considered among the more dignified species in the chamber, were expressions of carefully maintained neutrality that was itself a kind of distance. Ambassador Osei stood at the podium and did not move. Her expression did not change. She watched the chamber and let it happen, and stored every detail in a memory that had been trained over 15 years to hold exactly this kind of moment. The formal speakers went in order after that. One by one they addressed the motion. The language was mostly careful and indirect, the kind of language built over centuries to deny people things while making the denial sound like concern for them. Species after species expressed the view that humanity's development as a responsible galactic community member was ongoing, that the timeline for status review should follow established precedent, that the Accord's protective frameworks were sufficient for the needs of all Tier 3 peoples. When the vote came, the tally was 45 against and 2 in favor. The 2 in favor were Earth's own representative vote and the vote of the Tashari, a small avian species from the Outer Rim who had been Tier 3 themselves for 60 years and whose status review requests had been denied a dozen times. Their delegate had not spoken. They had simply voted and then sat very still, watching the chamber with their bright, unreadable eyes. Ambassador Osei walked out of the Grand Council chamber and sent one message back to Earth. It was 3 words: vote result received. Then she sat in a corridor for exactly 4 minutes, doing nothing, and then she stood up and went to file the paperwork that Article 19 required for the formal record of a denied petition. On Callisto, Mara Voss received the vote result on a screen in the construction bay. She read it once. The chamber around her was full of the sound of engineering work, the hiss of pressure tools, and the rhythmic clang of assembly teams completing final hull checks on Prometheus, which was now fully plated and sitting in her launch cradle with her internal systems running at idle. Mara read the result a second time. Not because she had not understood it the first time. because she wanted to be sure that she would always remember exactly what it said, and what it meant, and what had been decided not just about warships, but about the people whose lives the vote had been a comment on. Then she opened the command channel to the facility coordinators at all 7 sites. She said, "Arm them all." What followed in the next 72 hours was not dramatic in appearance. It looked like routine installation work. Teams moved equipment modules that had been sitting in storage bays, already certified and documented, and fitted them into the recesses that had been waiting for them since the hulls were first framed. The weapons bays slid into place with the kind of mechanical precision that comes from having been designed to fit exactly, and having been tested in simulation more times than anyone could reasonably count. Power couplings connected. Targeting systems initialized and ran self-diagnostics. ARS ran a final integration check across all 14 ships simultaneously. It found 11 minor calibration issues and corrected them without being asked. It flagged 1 non-critical sensor alignment on Epimetheus and recommended a manual adjustment. The adjustment was made. By hour 60, Prometheus was armed. By hour 68, the fleet was armed. All 14 ships. They were still registered as heavy freight haulers. That was true in the way that a great many things are technically true. But when Prometheus rose slowly from her cradle in the underground bay, and her engines lit to full power for the first time, filling the chamber with light and a low vibration that the crew felt in their chests, she was not a freight hauler. She had never been a freight hauler in any sense that mattered. She was a warship. The first human warship built in defiance of a galaxy that had decided humans should not have them. And then Epimetheus launched. And then Forge of Nations. And then 11 more. 14 ships rose from 7 hidden facilities across the outer solar system and formed up in the dark between Jupiter and the edge of human space. They ran quiet, their transponders broadcasting the civilian codes they had always used, their external profiles looking like exactly what their paperwork said they were. They held their formation and waited for orders. The orders were already prepared. They had been prepared for 3 months. Mara knew this because she had helped write them. She had sat in a room with military strategists and read every intelligence report on Kreth Dominion patrol patterns in the Verith frontier. She had looked at the projections and the risk assessments and the casualty estimates. She had looked at the name Harrow's Landing, the 4th human colony on the frontier, the one that had not yet been hit, and thought about the 3,000 people who lived there. Then she had looked at the name of the next target in the Kreth patrol schedule, which the intelligence teams had worked hard to obtain, and confirmed what she already knew. The 4th raid was coming. Prometheus and her fleet were going to be there first. Harrow's Landing had been built on a wide, flat plain between 2 mountain ranges, on a world the colony charter had named Verath 7, at which the people who lived there had taken to calling Red Rock, on account of the deep crimson soil that stained everything it touched. The colony was 6 years old and had grown to just under 3,000 residents. There were 2 main streets, a school that doubled as a community hall, a medical center that was always understaffed, a repair depot for the farming equipment, and a bar called the Long Way Round that had been the first permanent building completed, and which the settlers considered a point of pride. The children born on Red Rock had a particular habit of picking up smooth stones from the riverbed 2 kilometers east of the main settlement and carrying them in their pockets. Nobody had started the habit. It had simply appeared among the first generation of children who had grown up with this world as their only world, as if the planet had worked something into them that they expressed in small, quiet ways. On the morning of what the colony's calendar listed as the 17th of March, a proximity alarm went off at the colony's communications post. The operator on duty, a young man named Roe Castle, who had moved to Red Rock from New Auckland 4 years earlier, looked at his screens and felt something happen in his stomach that was not exactly fear, but was the body preparing for fear. 22 ships had come out of FTL at the edge of the system. Their transponder codes were Kreth Dominion military. Rose sent the distress signal immediately, and then spent 11 minutes watching the Kreth fleet accelerate inward on his screens, doing the calculation he did not want to do, which told him that at their current velocity, they would reach Red Rock's orbit in approximately 4 hours. He sent a second signal, and then a third. He broadcast on every emergency frequency the colony had access to. The colony's administrator came into the communications post. The doctor came. Teachers came. People started moving toward the emergency shelters. Nobody expected those shelters to matter much. They had been built to accord civilian standards, which meant they were designed to protect people from weather and from the kind of accidents that happened during resource extraction work. They were not designed for this. Then Rose's screens showed something else. Something coming in from the direction of the inner system, from the dark space between the colony's star and the gas giant that shepherded Red Rock's orbital path. Multiple contacts, moving fast, transponders broadcasting civilian freight codes. He stared at them for a long moment. He sent a hail. He waited. Captain Dion Asher answered the hail from the bridge of Prometheus, while his crew was still running the last pre-combat checks. He had a calm voice, which was a professional habit, and dark eyes that in this moment were watching 6 different screens at once. He was 44 years old, and he had commanded vessels before, though not like this one. And he had been in dangerous situations before, though not like this one either. He told the communications operator at Harrow's Landing that they were inbound, that they had seen the distress signals, and that the colony should get its people into shelter and stay there. Ro Cassell recorded that conversation and kept the recording for the rest of his life. Prometheus came out of her fast approach burn and decelerated into the engagement space between the incoming Kreth fleet and Red Rock's upper atmosphere, with 4 escorts spreading to flanking positions. The geometry had been calculated by Ares and confirmed by the tactical team. They were taking the inside position between the Kreth and the planet. If the Kreth wanted to reach Harrow's Landing, they had to come through the human ships first. The Kreth fleet commander opened a channel. The translation came through in the flat Accord standard voice that both sides were using. The Kreth commander demanded to know the identification and purpose of the vessels blocking his approach vector. He noted that the transponder codes indicated civilian freight carriers and stated that their presence in a declared territorial operation was irregular and grounds for immediate removal by force. Dion looked at his comms officer, who gave him the open channel indication. He said, "We updated our registration." Then the Kreth commander began what sounded like the opening of a formal warning transmission, the kind that preceded an enforcement action against civilian vessels. Dion had been told, by the strategic planners who had spent 3 months preparing for this moment, that it was important not to fire first. Not for legal reasons. The legal situation was already so complicated that a few more seconds would not change anything. The reason was simpler. He wanted the Kreth commander to understand very clearly that what was about to happen was the Kreth commander's own choice. The first Kreth weapon fired at Prometheus hit her on the port bow quarter. The impact shook the bridge hard enough that one crew member was thrown from his station. The hull plating held. The damage assessment came in 2 seconds later, showing superficial scoring and no penetration. Dion gave the order. What followed was not the kind of battle that the Accord's military theorists wrote about. Those battles followed established doctrine, the product of centuries of codified engagement rules, between species who all understood the same tactical language, and who, at some level, expected each other to behave in familiar ways. There was a grammar to Accord warfare, a set of moves and countermoves that each side understood, even while trying to defeat the other. The human ships did not follow that grammar. They had been designed by engineers who had spent years studying every Accord engagement on record, and identifying every assumption that Accord commanders made, every rhythm they relied on, every moment of predictable behavior. Eris had run 900 million simulations specifically to find those patterns, and then find ways to break them. Prometheus drove straight through the center of the Kreth formation, rather than engaging from range. This was not the correct thing to do by any Accord tactical doctrine, because it brought her into close range of multiple enemy vessels simultaneously, which should have been catastrophic. It was not catastrophic because the Ares tactical system was managing her shield cycling and point defense faster than any crew could manually coordinate, and because her hull could absorb hits that would have broken apart a standard Accord warship. The Kretz ships were not accustomed to targets that kept moving after being hit. They were not accustomed to opponents who ignored the standard engagement distances. They were not accustomed to weapons fire that came from directions their tactical systems had not flagged as probable attack vectors, because Ares was continuously updating approach angles in ways that their automated defenses were 2 to 3 seconds behind in compensating for. 2 of Prometheus's escort ships took heavy damage in the first 20 minutes. One of them, the Endurance, lost her primary engine array and had to run on secondary propulsion. Her crew kept fighting. Her weapon systems kept firing. The Kreth fleet tried to regroup twice. Ares identified both attempts and fed course adjustments to the human ships before the Kreth maneuvers were complete. The second regrouping attempt ended when the Kreth flagship took 3 successive hits to her command section, and her formation coordination stopped. After that, the Kreth ships began breaking away. Not all at once. One, then another, then a cluster of 4 moving in the same direction, pushing out of the engagement zone and accelerating toward the FTL threshold. The human ships let them go. Dion had been clear about that in his pre-battle briefing. The goal was not to destroy them all. The goal was to make them leave. The last Kreth ship crossed the FTL threshold at 1 hour and 14 minutes after the first shot was fired. The engagement space around Red Rock went quiet. On Prometheus's bridge, nobody cheered. Dion looked at his crew, and they looked back at him, and there was something in the room that was not triumph exactly. It was more like the feeling of having done a thing that could not be undone, which was both right and heavy in a way that was hard to separate from each other. The damage reports came in. Endurance was in serious trouble and needed immediate repair support. Steadfast had hull breaches in 2 sections that were contained but critical. The casualty list built up slowly across the fleet's medical channels. 31 dead. The numbers kept updating as the medics worked, and Dion watched each update come in without looking away. 31 people who had been alive when they launched from the dark space between Jupiter and the frontier, and who were not alive now. He thought about Harrow's Landing, about 3,000 people who had been in shelters, who were coming out now, who were alive. He did not think that made the 31 into something other than what they were. He held both things at the same time, which was the only honest way to hold them. Every surviving Kreth ship had been broadcasting on open frequencies for the last 40 minutes of the battle. Standard emergency protocols activated automatically on heavily damaged vessels. Every one of those broadcasts had been received by relay stations. Within hours, the recordings were propagating through Accord communication networks. The entire galaxy watched what had happened at Harrow's Landing. And the Accord, for the first time in 800 years, had no prepared response for what it had seen. The fleet sat at the edge of the Accord's capital system for 11 days before anyone in the Grand Council formally acknowledged it was there. Prometheus and her 12 remaining operational ships held their position in the outer dark, beyond the traffic lanes and the monitored approach corridors, visible on every sensor array that the capital station operated, and on every deep space scanner that the member species pointed in that direction. They were not threatening anything. They were not blocking anything. They were simply there, 14 human ships in a loose formation, running their navigation lights and broadcasting their civilian transponder codes in a way that everyone in the system understood was a kind of joke that wasn't entirely a joke. The emergency sessions inside the Grand Council had been running almost continuously since the battle footage arrived. The recordings from the Kreth ships had been played and replayed, analyzed by military specialists from a dozen species, and discussed in tones ranging from careful alarm to something closer to panic. The Accord had no protocol for this exact situation. It had protocols for species that violated the warship prohibition, but those protocols assumed the violating species had built perhaps 1 or 2 vessels in secret, not a fleet, and had not then used that fleet to defend a civilian population in a battle that every communications network in explored space had now broadcast to every species that owned a screen. The Crest Dominion's position was complicated by the fact that their ships had fired first, and that this was clearly documented. Their delegation had spent 3 days trying to frame the engagement as a response to human military provocation, before the recordings made that argument too difficult to maintain with any credibility. Ambassador Osei arrived at the capital station on the 12th day. She came alone, on a shuttle, through the standard civilian docking procedures, and she walked through the station's corridors with the same careful, upright bearing she had always used, nodding to the station staff who recognized her, ignoring the representatives of several species who looked away when she passed. She was shown to the same chamber she had addressed 5 times before. The Grand Council session that day was not open to observers. The gallery was closed. The chamber held only the representatives and their immediate staff. Osei noted this as she took her position at the center podium. She thought about the last time she had stood here, and the sound the chamber had made, and she filed that memory in the same place she filed all the ones that mattered most. She spoke for 25 minutes. She did not talk about the battle. Everyone in the room had seen the recordings far more times than necessary. She did not talk about the fleet waiting at the edge of the system, because mentioning it as a pressure tactic would undermine the point she was actually making. She talked about law. She said that humanity was formally notifying the Grand Council of its withdrawal from the Warship Prohibition Clause of the Tier 3 membership agreement, effective immediately. She was careful to use the word notifying and not requesting. She said that under the review provisions of Article 31 of the Founding Charter, a member species could withdraw from specific clauses of its membership agreement under circumstances of demonstrated failure of Accord protective obligations, and that she was prepared to submit the full legal argument and evidentiary record if the Council wished to review it. Though she suspected that most of the representatives in the room had already had their own legal teams look at Article 31 in some detail over the past 11 days. She said that humans had not built their ships to conquer. They had built them because they had learned, at the cost of 3 burned colonies and the lives of their people, that no one else would protect them. They had followed the Accord's rules. They had used every process the Accord offered. They had asked for justice and been given procedures. They had asked for protection and been given committees. They had asked for the right to defend themselves and been told they were too dangerous to be trusted, while the species that killed their children sat in that same chamber and voted and were trusted completely. She said that humans understood the Accord was old, and that its structures had been built with care over centuries, and that she was not standing here to tear those structures down. She was standing here because her people had needed something and had not been given it, and had therefore built it themselves, and were not going to apologize for that, and were not going to pretend it had not happened, and were not going to sit in another session in another year and ask for another vote that would go 45-2. She said, very quietly, that she wanted to be understood, that she was not there to threaten anyone, that the fleet at the edge of the system was not an invasion and would not become one. She said that humans were not standing in that chamber trying to prove they were dangerous. They were standing there, she said, so that no one in that chamber would ever again believe they were not. Then she sat down. The session lasted 9 hours. Osei remained in the chamber through all of it, listening to the deliberations, answering questions when they were addressed to her, providing documents and legal citations as requested. The arguments were long and complex, and often seemed to be about something other than what they were technically about. Several species spoke with visible tension. Old alliances shifted in ways that the observers watching from outside the closed doors could not see, but that the representatives inside could feel clearly. The Crest Dominion's delegation went very quiet after the third hour, and stayed that way. At the end of the session, 3 things happened. The Grand Council voted, by a margin of 29 to 16, to accept the formal notification of withdrawal from the Warship Prohibition Clause. It was not a vote in favor of human ships. It was an acknowledgement that the legal argument was sound enough, and the political cost of rejecting it was too high. Osei noted the margin and the faces, and did not express what she felt about either. The Council also voted to open a formal war crimes investigation into the Creth Dominion's actions on the Varath frontier. This vote passed 24 to 23, the slimmest margin possible. Osei had been told before the session that this vote was the one that mattered most to the families of the dead. She had not told the Council that, but she had made sure the evidentiary record was thorough enough to make it possible. The third thing that happened was quieter and did not involve a vote. Osei's secure communication channel received 7 private messages in the hours after the session ended. Each one was from the diplomatic representative of a small species, none of them Tier 2 or above, all of them members of the Accord for decades longer than humanity had been. The messages were careful and indirect, because careful indirectness was a habit that came from long experience with what happened to small species who were too direct about the wrong things. But the meaning in each of them was the same. They had been watching what humans had done. They had been watching for a long time. They would like to talk. Mara Voss was in the main engineering bay of Prometheus when the session results came through. She had spent the last several days overseeing repair work, which was detailed and slow, and deeply familiar in the way that fixing things was always more comfortable than waiting for decisions to be made. She read the results on a screen while a technician worked on a power relay 2 meters away, the sound of tools filling the bay. She read the war crimes investigation approval twice, and sat with it for a long moment. Then she went back to the upper deck and stood at the observation viewport that she had stood at 100 times since Prometheus was first operational. Jupiter was visible from here as a pale brightness against the dark, small with distance, the way large things sometimes looked when you were far enough from them. The stars were everywhere, as they always were, dense and cold and very old. A young engineer from the repair team appeared at the hatchway behind her. His name was Beck, and he was 23 years old and had grown up on a station and had the particular ease of someone who had never known gravity as the default state of things. He had been with the project for 6 months and had a habit of asking questions that were worth answering. He asked her what they built next. Mara looked at the stars for another moment. She thought about the 7 diplomatic messages sitting in a secure channel. She thought about 24 to 23. She thought about Piotr, which she did every day, and which was a different kind of thinking than it had been a year ago. She thought about the ships they had built in secret, in the dark, under the noses of a galaxy that had told them they could not do it. She thought about what they had proved, which was not that humans were dangerous. She had never cared very much about proving that. What they had proved was that humans could not be stopped from protecting their own, and could not be kept from doing what they decided was necessary, and could not be held in a category that did not fit them by people who needed them to stay small. She thought about the 7 species who wanted to talk. She smiled. It was a small smile, but it was real, and it had something in it that had not been there since Brightwell. She said, "Whatever we want." The fleet held its formation at the edge of the system, navigation lights steady, transponders broadcasting their civilian codes, waiting for whatever came next. The stars did not change. The dark did not change. But something in the space between the human ships and the rest of the galaxy had shifted. The way things shift when a door that has been locked for a long time is finally opened, and the room beyond turns out to be larger than anyone had admitted.